Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are diving into Lecture 2 of our 4-part deep dive into sex writing and age gap relationships and how they are being treated in fiction in 2025. So I'm really excited to dive into Playworld by Adam Ross. This is a book I knew nothing about. I was wandering around my local independent bookstore recently, and I kept seeing this on, the tables out front, and picking it up and looking at it. The cover is actually very striking. I really was drawn in by this cover. Those of you on the YouTube, I'm holding it up just to jog your memory. Those of you who are listening to the podcast, it's like the back of someone's head with two women's hands. It's like clearly someone like making out. And I would pick it up and I would read the jacket copy. And then when I decided to go ahead and do this deep dive into age gap relationships, I remembered, in fact, that this book fit right in. And in some ways, this book is an anomaly compared to the other 3 books that we are looking at. Number 1, it is written by a man. The other 3 books we are looking at were written by women. Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, The Young Man by Annie Ernaux, and The Awakening by Kate Chopin. And in many ways, it really does feel like this book is written by a man. We have a young adolescent 14-year-old boy who is at the center of the whole thing. It is told largely from his perspective. So we are really mired in a very male-focused world in many ways. And I think that inflects almost everything about the novel. So those of you who didn't listen in the first time to the first installment, which was about Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, I'll only very quickly repeat the fact that I think in this day and age, in 2025, we have this kind of interesting re-envisioning of age gap relationships where you have a much older woman who is having a sexual relationship with a much younger man. For me, this was all really kicked off by Miranda July's All Fours, and that was this really optimistic, really interesting look at sexual desire in a woman who was actually menopausal or perimenopausal. July was known for having written the great perimenopausal novel, which I loved. And I found that book so inspirational and so interesting. And it was really cool to look at these 4 books and find 4 very, very different depictions of this kind of age gap relationship. While we are looking at this, of course, and talking about female desire, we're also looking at sex writing. And I will repeat right at the top the thing that I always end up saying, which is the very best sex writing simply describes what is happening in, very plain terms. We're talking just like anatomy, just tell us what is going on. Once we get into metaphor and simile and, extended metaphor, for my money, you are always not as well off. And I will say today, Playworld by Adam Ross is going to give us a look at the kind of metaphorical description of sex that I think is simply not as effective as when someone just tells you what is up. So you can imagine that when I took up this book, and here we are in this moment where I think these age gap relationships and women's sexual desire is really sort of, at the fore in some important fictional pieces of work, I was very excited to see what this guy, who I had never read anything by Adam Ross before, I was very interested to see what he was going to do. And I was really hoping that we would have something sort of new and interesting to say about an older woman and a younger man. I will say from the top that we're talking about a 14-year-old boy and a 36-year-old woman. And that is, that's a gap that doesn't feel particularly comfortable for anyone, I don't think. So in many ways, I went into this understanding that it was going to be very tricky to talk about empowerment on the part of the woman, when in fact, her age compared to the age of a child is highly, highly problematic. Still, I was hoping that we were going to have something interesting, something kind of new come out of this. It wasn't going to just be like a Mrs. Robinson kind of moment. And I have to say the answer to that is no. I don't think we're doing anything particularly interesting with older women's female desire in this book. I kept thinking maybe, I don't know, we would have some sort of, something from her perspective or something interesting. And the answer to that is also no. I was also so weirded out because we just finished Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, and the Naomi is one of the characters in that novel. And then I open up Playworld, and in fact, also it is Naomi. So we've got a lot of Naomis in the ether these days. So I'm going to cover the agenda, and then we're going to dive on in. The controlling idea of today's lecture, though, is that I felt a little bit duped. When you read the jacket copy and when you look at the prologue, everything seems to point to the idea that this age gap relationship is really central in this novel, and I found that that was actually not the case. So here's the agenda. Here's how we're going to dive into my thesis. First, we're going to talk about elements that really make you think that the book is about this relationship between Naomi and Griffin. That is the cover art, which I just described. the jacket copy, and the prologue. So we're going to take a look. I mean, it's not quite a red herring because obviously it is. This relationship is a significant part of the novel, but it just wasn't at the center in a way that I felt like we were led to believe it would be. We're then going to talk about the actual focus of the book. At one point, they use the word miseducation. We will get to that. And honestly, there were other elements of the book that felt much more like a miseducation in my mind. So we're going to talk about like the actual focus of the book. We're going to then look at sex writing, which is going to be a very good counterpoint actually to intermezzo. I think Sally Rooney's sex writing is actually very good. She does the thing that I think is most effective, where she simply describes what is happening. With Adam Ross, we're going to have something quite different. We're then going to discuss some elements of the book that I really liked. This is a very long book. In fact, I do think it is too long. It is digressive. I mean, here I was just going to tell you all the things I like, and then I'm veering off into some of my quibbles. But there is a lot to like in this book. So I'm going to quickly run through some of those elements, and then I'm going to quickly run through a few of my quibbles. Okay, we're going to dive in by talking about the elements of this book that led me to believe that the age gap relationship was going to be central. So first and foremost, we have this cover art. So I briefly described it. I actually really love the color. I love the font. I love the way that they have a novel split visually, the way that they do. I found the cover art, it doesn't quite look like an older woman's hands. Those look like very young, supple hands. I also find it interesting. They don't have any rings or anything. I mean, those just like don't quite look like Naomi's hands to me. I am not someone, obviously, who needs to have the cover correspond exactly with what's happening in the book, but this was one way in which I felt kind of misled. But more important, the real key to this novel is that it's really putting forward this idea of the relationship between a young man and some woman. I mean, if you have this photograph on the cover, it's very hard to argue that that is not the controlling idea in the book. That is not the central tension in the book. I do think it gives us a pretty good idea of kind of the like predatory nature of Naomi Shaw. You have the idea here. It's a young man, perhaps the back of his head, and this person who is presumably kissing him is really like gripping the back of his head. We also have this idea that he's not exactly unwilling, but the fact that we don't see his face and he seems to be standing up straight, all of that makes us think that, this is someone who's a woman who is very actively making out with this person. Now, if the cover was slightly misleading, the jacket copy is just like downright misleading. Here is what we have. We have two nice fat blurbs up at the top of the jacket copy. I mean, I'll say it again. Those of you who've listened to the Fox page for a long time know that I'm a little ambivalent about jacket copy. I try to avoid it a lot of the time because I really don't love the way that it sort of cants a text in a certain direction and sort of raises certain expectations. Often there's just like an outright spoiler in there. Not always like what's going to happen at the end, like the huge plot spoiler, but there'll be some element that will be discussed in the jacket copy that I would much rather come across myself. In this case, I did go ahead and look at the jacket copy because I didn't know Adam Ross. I hadn't heard anything about the book, was compelled by the cover art, but didn't have a sense of what this book was all about. I did, in fact, read the jacket copy and was very much drawn in by it. Then after the two blurbs, we have a little excerpt. It's in italics and it's set apart, so I think we assume that it is from the text, and it reads this. In the fall of 1980, when I was 14, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of two, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. It is always so interesting to go back and look at the beginning of a work once you have finished it. So, I mean, he is alluding there, sort of fairly, I have to give him credit for saying a lot of things happened that year that were strange, but that didn't seem strange at the time. But we are definitely front-loading the idea of this relationship between the 36-year-old woman and the 14-year-old kid. You do have a sense here, I mean, the predatory nature of this whole thing is kind of right up front, this idea that she fell in love with him. We do not get the sense from the beginning that this was even in fact requited. We have a sense that she's a mother of two, which really, it's interesting the way that when you put sexual desire together with any kind of maternity, that it seems like extra like sinful or extra crazy or extra something. So I thought it was very interesting that they're foregrounding her maternity right here on the jacket copy. So we have that little blurb, and then we have the rest of the jacket copy, which I'm going to read to you quickly. Griffin Hunt is in over his head between his role as Peter Proton on the hit TV show The Nuclear Family and the pressure of high school at New York's elite Boyd Prep, along with the increasingly compromising demands of his wrestling coach, he's teetering on the edge of collapse. Okay, so that's setting up several things that actually, in my opinion, are really the lifeblood of the novel. And then we have this. Then comes Naomi Shaw, 22 years Griffin's senior, unwilling to lay his burdens on his shrink, whom he shares with his father, mother, and younger brother Orrin. Griffin soon finds himself in the back of Naomi's Mercedes sedan again and again, confessing all to the one person who might do him the most harm. So here again, I mean, we are really, really pushing the idea of her predatory nature, which is fair. I mean, this is very much a novel about an older woman who is somewhat predatory, someone who is really, has a lot of issues that she should be working out on her own, that she is in fact working out with a 14-year-old child. We go on. Less a Bildungsroman than a story of miseducation, Playworld is a novel of epic proportions, bursting with laughter and heartache. And this is very interesting to me. I mean, I do think there are lots and lots of Catcher in the Rye elements here. I mean, we could do a whole entire lecture on all of the parallels, which I think is actually sort of interesting. But very much like Catcher in the Rye, we are seeing, a very short span of time, like a 1 year. In this case, 1 year. In Holden Caulfield's case, it's like, I don't know, it's a few days, I think, that he's in New York after he gets kicked out of his school. But the idea of a Bildungsroman, which is like, a novel that's all about like coming of age, I mean, it's kind of like generally over a slightly longer period of time. I mean, not always, but this is sort of broad strokes here. But so we have this 1 year in his life that is decisive in many ways, is sort of his coming of age. And I think it's an interesting distinction they're making between this kind of coming of age novel and a novel of miseducation. And I think when we read that in the context of the jacket copy, we are really led to believe that the person who is miseducating him is Naomi Shaw. And in fact, that is the case. But I would argue that his wrestling coach, who is alluded to, but like always in these, dependent clauses that are like set off by M dashes or that are like practically in parentheses, making them like a very minor part of the story. Really, in my opinion, it is the wrestling coach and the relationship with the wrestling coach that's kind of at the center. I really feel like we get more airtime with the coach. The coach is in some ways much more vivid to me. And what is happening with the coach, I mean, it's really sexual assault, which is, not to mention like all sorts of weird eating pressure and all sorts of, I mean, I don't really know the world of wrestling, but none of that stuff about making weight sounded good. So as much as they wanted me, well, I think they want anyone to pick this up and think that it's this older kind of Mrs. Robinson type who is going to provide this miseducation. And she does in some ways. I would argue it's really the wrestling coach. I liked the fact that they brought up in the very beginning in this jacket copy, before the book even started, the idea that she acts as sort of a therapist for him. This was a plot point in the book that actually was very confusing to me. When he would get into the back of her sedan, for a long time, they did not have a lot of physical interaction. And I was very confused by that, which is not great. If you're building this novel on this like miseducation with this kind of sexualized Mrs. Robinson who's fallen in love with a 14-year-old boy, you are assuming that some sex is going to happen. So it was confusing to me because I kept thinking like, because there would be like a gap and he'd say like later he got out of the car, afterwards or whatever. And I was like, wait, later as in like after sex or what? And we do come to find that they spend many, many afternoons in the back of her car, not having a lot of physical contact, but just having conversations that are in fact very helpful for him. So I like the idea that Naomi Shaw, she's not just kind of a one note, but I also would say that she is not the center of the novel. I would even go on to say, and this actually makes sense to me in some ways, the women in the book were kind of shadowy. I really liked the character of the mother, and I really, in some ways, was intrigued by the character of Naomi. But my sense of like the descriptions and the dialogue and our exposure to the men, no pun intended, exposure to the men in the novel, including the father and including the wrestling coach, and actually even including Mr. Shaw in many ways. All of the men in the book are written with much more, in my opinion and in my memory, with much more detail and more sort of texture to them, whereas the women characters do seem a little bit harder to pin down. So here I am telling you that we don't have a great, a very precise vision of Naomi Shaw, and we're going to take a look at the prologue where we actually have a pretty specific and detailed description of her. I find it interesting, though, even as we read through this, pay attention a little bit to how much you're really feeling about her. We're getting select details, and in some ways they hang together nicely. But this kind of physical description, once it is established in the beginning, it isn't a big part of it. We don't see Naomi very clearly. We do at the beginning in this very specific and actually kind of weird way. So here we have the beginning. We have that same little paragraph that they excerpted in the jacket copy. In the fall of 1980, when I was 14, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of two, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. So then we have the next paragraph. This is an example of something I like about the novel, where occasionally we will jump forward in time to the narrator in this kind of meta way. We have this first person narrator who is talking, as an older man who is writing about that year in his youth. So we have this. 2 decades later, when I finally told my mother, we were on Long Island taking a walk on the beach. She stopped, stunned, and said, "But she was such an ugly woman." Okay, you might imagine that that's slightly problematic for me. We're going to parse it in a minute. It's a very interesting statement in some ways, and I think he knows that because of what comes next. The remark wasn't as petty as it sounds, which I'm not sure that I believe that. Moving on. If I was aware of it then, it neither repulsed me or affected my feelings for Naomi. And there, when he says it, he means like the fact that she's ugly, that it didn't repulse him at the time, which, strong verb there. It was just a thing I took for granted, like the color of her hair. So we have the color of her hair. This is the end of the second paragraph. And then we have a paragraph that is devoted almost entirely to her hair and her eyeglasses. Listen. Wiry and ashen, it had the shading, but not the shimmer of pigeon feathers. I don't think any woman would be flattered that her hair was like pigeon feathers, but like didn't even have the shimmer. Naomi kept it long so that it fell past her shoulders. I knew it by touch, for my face was often buried in it. Only later did I wonder if she considered herself unattractive, because she always wore sunglasses as if to hide her face, large gold frames with blue-tinted prescription lenses. When we were driving together, which was often that year, she'd allow these to slide down her nose and then look at me over their bridge. She might have considered this pose winning, but it was more likely to see me better. Her mouth often hung slightly open, her lower teeth were uneven, and her tongue, which pressed against them, always tasted of coffee. Okay, this is not a flattering description, which is very interesting to me. I'm also interested in the fact this woman is 36 years old and apparently has gray hair that she wears really, really long. This book is taking place in 1986, which was a time when people were very freely coloring their hair. It's an interesting thing to imagine someone in that era embracing gray hair. Happily, I think that's happening all the time now. But I just found it like a little bit of a disconnect. I also was like, if you were trying to really lean into the age gap here, the 14 and 36 thing, I'm not sure we need gray hair. That's like really, a bit extreme. And it's also interesting to me that the other piece of description that we have of her is really hiding her face. It has nothing, well, it doesn't have nothing to do with her, but it's these sunglasses that are obscuring her face. And then when we do hear a little bit about her, it's her mouth and the mouth being slightly open. To me, that signals someone who's not very intelligent, which is funny. I'm not quite even sure why. And then her tongue always tasting of coffee. That's not great. I think, it's widely accepted that coffee breath is not a great thing. So I'm very interested in this prologue, partly because it is sustaining my idea that the book is very much about Mrs. Shaw and our young Griffin. But I'm also interested in the idea of really leaning into what I think is not a very flattering description at the beginning. So part of me, when I began to sort of think this through more, was like, okay, great. I actually think it's great that she's not like some beauty, like that he didn't fall in love with someone because she's like this absolutely striking, like, really alluring 36-year-old. I like the idea in some ways that what we are talking about here is someone who's kind of a normal looking woman. I think maybe in some ways it made it feel kind of like less predatory, that she's not really like trying to make herself overly sexual with her gray hair and her coffee breath and her sunglasses. But even if I am sort of positive about the fact that she's not like this, bombshell, I then kind of quickly get to this thing that's like, but why all the description and why the kind of unflattering description? This is like one of these kind of ambivalent things. It's the shadowy nature of Mrs. Shaw, and also this idea of presenting something like the age gap relationship and really leaning into it, but then kind of not developing it in a way that is interesting. So that is a perfect segue into what the book is actually about. And in fact, the book is about a lot of stuff. It just so happens that the stuff that I was interested in is not the focus. It is a book that spends a lot of time talking about wrestling, spends a lot of time talking about the family that he is in, the actual nuclear family, his family of origin. It has quite a bit to do with life at a prep school when you don't necessarily feel like you're smart enough to be there. It has a lot to do with Dungeons and Dragons, which I have to say I did skim that part. It also has to do with unrequited love. It seemed somewhat predictable, but also sort of satisfying to me that we have this relationship with Naomi Shaw. We have this age gap relationship, but we also have this relationship that our young Griffin is trying to establish with someone his own age. But the thing that seemed most central to me, actually, and I said this before, is the wrestling part. So what was interesting about that is that here we have this wrestling coach, a man in a position of real authority, who is really very kind of obviously and very significantly involving these kids in ways that are downright abusive. I mean, to be having these like private wrestling matches with them, I think both in his apartment and also in some really creepy kind of dungeon-esque place at the school. Like this man, in many ways, that seemed like the real story, the real miseducation in the novel. I literally almost forgot to mention all of the stuff about being a child actor, which I was just like so bummed out that there wasn't more of that. I really liked the idea that he was being made to act because he needed the money and that it was this big stress for his family. And it was also his father's career and the source of a lot of his father's, sense of self. Like that was all so interesting to me. And I wanted to see more of like what it would be like to be a child actor in New York City in the 80s. But literally the fact that I almost forgot that it was an element of the book is very telling. I was very frustrated by that. And in the jacket copy, I mean, it's one of the very first things is that he has this, this job as Timmy Neutron or whatever it is. So that is, that was an element that we saw quite a bit of instead of, seeing this age gap relationship. But I was also very frustrated because I wanted more of that. Okay, we're now going to get to the actual sex writing in the book. I mean, there was surprisingly little. I'll go so far as to say like disappointingly little. And I don't mean that really. Like, I'm not someone who really likes to read sex in novels. I just get so distracted by like how well it's being done because it is a hard thing to pull off. So it's just not something that I generally am like loving reading about. But for a book that purports to speak about this age gap relationship, and at least in some ways about older women's sexual desire, there really was very, very little sex happening. I was disappointed that the wrestling scenes and like literally like the sexual nature of them and the sexual description of what was happening in these times of abuse, that was way more vivid than what was happening ever with Naomi Shaw. So I want to take a look at some of the different descriptions where we do have either sex or the lack of sex in the novel. We came to a stop, upon which she turned to face me and half smiled, a concerned, bittersweet expression I mimicked but did not understand. She reached out and placed her palm on my cheek. I had never been touched like this. I felt strangely stirred, a little sad, and I closed my eyes instantly like one of those dolls when you tip back its head, which is interesting just because we have like the baby doll mom thing, which is, kind of creepy and weird. He's also a little sad. He's also closing his eyes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here about that does make her seem, I think sort of predatory. Then it goes on. I was so tired suddenly. My relief was so palpable, I thought I might fall asleep. I could feel Naomi take my temples pulse, its Phillips traveling along her fingertips and up her arm. Literally in like the margin, it's like, what? With all these question marks. It's a description that I think is totally overwrought. And he's generally such a good writer that when things like this happen, it sort of stands out for me. Part of the problem there, I mean, first of all, Phillips, like, I don't even really know what that is. They're also at a stop sign. I mean, at a stoplight. So, like, here you have, like, it's hard to picture what is happening here. He's leaning against her, but, like, does he have his head on her shoulder? And now she has, it's hard to picture. But also the idea of these Phillips traveling up her arm, there's a funny disconnect because he's so clearly, this first person narrator is so clearly in the position of Griffin that we're like, wait, how do you know what she's feeling? How do we know the sensations that are traveling up her arm? It was strange. Also, taking the pulse at my temple, I mean, I guess it just seems like random enough that it really kind of pulls the reader out of the scene, which is deadly. Okay, moving on. She shook her hair away from her sunglasses, and we drove back to my street without speaking. She pulled into the driveway. Before I got out of the car, we said goodbye very formally, perhaps a bit hurriedly, and then I watched her drive to West End Avenue, signal left, and disappear. It's interesting how much that's an echo of the very last part of the book when he is on his bicycle, which is actually just a very nice echo. I mean, here he's being ferried around by this woman, and at the end of the novel, we have him, riding off on his own on his bicycle, which is much more appropriate. I mean, this is obviously not about sex writing because they're definitely not having sex like at a stoplight here. But this is kind of the beginning of their whole kind of sex relationship. And what's interesting, I really liked this element of the book. Right across the page here on 35, we realize, or the narrator tells us, that Griffin is like very sexually aroused by the whole thing. But then we find out this: it had never occurred to me to masturbate since no one had taught me how. So that was so interesting to me. I think it's probably a little bit unusual to have a 14-year-old boy never having masturbated. I also kind of feel like maybe that's one of these things that you figure out by yourself. Allow me to jump up on my soapbox here and just say that, like, certainly in the generation of young women in the 80s, nobody was showing you how to masturbate. Nobody was talking about masturbation. Thank goodness I think that that is changing. I'm not sure that people are really like showing each other. Well, maybe they are. I don't know. Good for them. But I will note, as we should always be thinking about the double standard here about, young male sexual pleasure versus young female sexual pleasure. Also, of course, in the context of, looking at older women's sexual desire. Okay, we're going to move on to pages 62 and 63, where we do finally have some kind of sexual interaction between them. On the verge of becoming a man, there are times when I relished being a boy. Now, for instance, in the backseat of Naomi's car. Having concluded my story, I leaned into her outstretched arms, burying my wet face in her neck. Oh, baby, she said, rocking me side to side. I'm getting like a little extra creeped out as I'm reading this about the mother baby kind of motif that is emerging. You had a really bad day. Memory being what it is, I often wonder how I actually told her this tale. So this is very important because here our narrator is pulling back a little bit, pulling the lens of the camera back and admitting that he doesn't have all of the details, and that what we are getting here is a description not of like every single thing that's happening in this moment, but kind of like this like vague kind of understanding that's a little shadowy, which is part of the problem why I kept wondering whether like what kind of sex stuff was happening between the two of them. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. I often wonder how I actually told her this tale. I'm sure it was more rudimentary, disorganized, that I'd hopped from one point of frustration to the next, so that it sounded like a list of complaints about a life that was unmanageable. I couldn't keep up with acting, with school. I disappointed Miss Sullins. I couldn't disappoint Coach. My father didn't care. So again, like here, even when the two of them are together and we're expecting some sort of intimacy, we're mostly talking about all of these other things that are happening in his life. What I do remember is this. When I'd finally calmed down, after Naomi took my cheeks in her palms and then kissed the corners of my eyes and pressed her lips to the edge of mine, and I finally kissed her back, she suddenly stopped us. Why don't you just quit? Naomi whispered. The show, acting, all of it. Don't you understand? I said, as if it were obvious. I pay for my private school. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. I found that last sentence both redundant with something that had happened before and also kind of anticlimactic and weirdly kind of beside the point. I mean, he's driving home the idea here that he can't quit acting, which in many ways is the tension of this scene. I mean, it's fine. And I think maybe readers were very satisfied with this idea of like this intimacy, the sexual intimacy between the two of them sort of, developing very slowly over time. And it was fine, but there were some descriptions where it was frustratingly kind of not clear. So we're going to take a look at one of those. On page 64, Naomi parked. We hurried to the back seat. We pretended we were rushing because of the frigid gusts off the water, which made my tie ripple and stiffen and Naomi's skirt snap. I thought that was so funny. I mean, this is a little bit of figurative language here. We have his tie rippling and stiffening. I mean, ties are absolutely a phallic symbol. And the idea of one rippling and stiffening in this kind of context is very obvious in many ways. And then we have this idea of Naomi's skirt snapping. So the idea of talking about a tie and a skirt, I mean, there's all sorts of sexual innuendo here. The doors slammed shut. Silence again. Often we began to speak simultaneously. You first, Naomi said. At some point, after what seemed like only minutes later, she'd glanced at her watch and, with a tone close to regret, say, I'm afraid we've run out of time. This is really leaning into the idea that she's kind of another therapist, which I liked that. That seemed fine to me. And then it goes on. My disappointment bordered on frustration because it felt as if I was on the verge of something, of articulating a solution to a problem I could not name. It was this speechlessness at this moment that I found upsetting, a distress that Naomi seized on and I allowed. She slid down in the seat. I did as well. With the back of her finger, she might trace the line from my ear's lobe to my lips. I'm not sure why it's might. Like, why is she might trace it? I mean, did she? Did she not? She regarded me with an expression somewhere between wonder and caution, between curiosity and fear. She liked to kiss my eyes next, which I closed. So, this idea of she liked to do something, we have this thing that used to happen all the time that she liked to kiss his eyes, which is a little confusing because we're moving from like a very specific incident to what was happening more often in these situations. She kissed her way toward the edge of my mouth until I finally kissed her back. She sometimes took my hand nearest her hip and firmly pressed it to her knee, indicating that I was not to touch her there, that I could, if I wished, lift her skirt's edge, that I was to feel her feeling my fingertips progress along her thigh, and I confess this frightened me. Until, as a gentle means of pausing us, as both bookmark and interruption, but now more an imitation of restraint, the wordless sounds she made became laughter. There was a feline growl to it, which didn't completely hide her nervousness and touched my heart. It was the only moment I thought she was acting. So this idea of the feline growl is, this kind of predatory nature, obviously like the whole cougar situation. So we are having a description where, he's welcome to put his hand up her skirt and they have slid down in the back of the car. And then we jump to the next paragraph, home soon and mom had made dinner. So there is a real deflation here, but it's also very confusing because we have this kind of, the sexual experience that's kind of on the brink, whatever we're thinking he has his hand moving up her skirt. Then you have the thing, home later. And oftentimes when you have a gap like that, it's almost like, when an author will say like afterwards, blah, 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 blah. And you are meant to understand that they have had sex. So in the margin on that page, I have sex and a question mark because it's not really clear what happened in that gap. He doesn't exit the car. We don't know if, how far his hand got up the skirt, blah, 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 all of this stuff. And maybe, this is an elaborate way to like have the reader experience the same frustration that Griffin is having, but I'm not sure it is super effective if that is the case. So I want to read kind of the next time that they're together or the next time we have a description of it because there's a part in here that I think is very funny. This is on page 75. Naomi's car was dark now. To my right, the West Side Highway winked and pulsed. With the windows up, its flashes were silent, like heat lightning. We'd finished talking some time ago. So again, that signals to me like if they'd finished talking some time ago, like what are they doing? Naomi sat there thinking. She had unbuttoned several buttons of my shirt and lightly dragged her fingernails over my chest. It made me so hard my penis was sore. So like that's all fine. That seems pretty good. I like the idea of, describing the fingernails doing whatever they're doing. Than this, I'd have enjoyed it more if I wasn't so afraid she'd notice. So that was confusing to me too. I was like, if she's, unbuttoning your shirt and dragging her fingernails across your chest, I think the idea is, in fact, to have someone be sexually aroused. I mean, maybe from the perspective of this 14-year-old boy, like these things are disconnected and she doesn't actually want that to happen. But this kind of confusion and this kind of ambivalence was a bit frustrating for me. So then we move on. Your little brother, Naomi said, how come he goes to a different school? Shame banished my boner. That's the part that I thought was funny. Part of it is the alliteration and just this idea of banishing a boner. I mean, really, it's the word boner. The word boner is always funny to me. There's excellent use of boner in all fours in one of my favorite scenes in that book. But more broadly, this is yet another thing where the reader feels like we are being set up to have some sort of sexual experience, and then it gets derailed. So I will remind you that this book is very long. We're going to take a look at a sex scene that is coming on page 432. It's a little strange the way that I'm setting up this lecture because it's not like I was dying for them to start having sex right away. It was more that I was confused by that element of pacing, sort of how the information about their sexual experiences was being sort of shared with me. So on 432, we finally we have them having intercourse. And so here we are having a chance to take a look at sex writing, which actually stands in fairly stark contrast to the excellent sex writing in Intermezzo on page 432. So this is Griffin and Naomi in the summertime. I kissed her now in the car with my eyes closed. Naomi paused. I felt her arch her hips high off the seat. I heard a hiss of fabric. Gently, she pulled my swimsuit below my knees and with her sandal's sole pushed it to the floor. All of that's good. I'm enjoying, just like how we're describing what's happening. And then she straddled me. In her fists, she clutched my scruff while we kissed. So here we have our narrator, emphasizing the fact that he's puppy-like, but the idea of clutching his scruff, I'm like, what, like all the extra skin at his neck? Like all of a sudden, I'm out of the scene because I'm like, really scruff? Like how puppy-like is this young man? And we continue. She eased herself down, and when she sank, it was as if she were hooding me, as if she were spreading wings over me, so that I felt entirely covered by her. So problematic here is as if she were hooding me. Like I kind of know what that means, but not really. And then as if she were spreading wings over me. Like again, I mean, I just don't think any of that is necessary. I think you could just say, she eased herself down. I mean, I think we could have left it at that. My nails bit into the skin where I clawed her legs. Her legs tightened against my hips. I felt something rise up, not a wave, but the pulse of one, far out at sea, gathering at great speed toward shore. The sound I made when it broke was close to a roar, and when I finally opened my eyes, I was staring up through the car's rear window into the fog, into the sky, and I felt as if my bones had been hollowed, and I was soaring through the clouds with no sense of the horizon. I mean, you guys, I am sorry. There is a lot to love in this book, but this is not, in my opinion, a great sex scene. So this whole extended metaphor of the wave, of his orgasm as like being this wave, the pulse of the wave, and then the wave breaking over him and the sound being a roar, the gathering great speed toward the shore. I mean, it's rough. It's rough. I mean, I think that this kind of metaphor, I don't know, it just never works for me. And you may be totally disagreeing. Maybe this was really, maybe this really spoke to you. But this kind of extended metaphor, it just gets very tricky. In this case, it also gets mixed because then we have this idea of the bones being hollowed, which is fine, and him looking up into the fog. But then instead of being a wave, instead of like, his pleasure being a wave, I was soaring through the clouds with no sense of the horizon. I'm just thinking, aren't there birds that have hollow bones? I mean, maybe now he's making like some sort of extended, bird metaphor. It's just not necessary. I just don't think it is adding to what is like kind of a monumental, like, consummation of their love. And then we go down to the end of the chapter, which actually really underscores both like the weird maternal thing that is happening here, but also the creepy kind of predatory nature. So down at the bottom of 432, they go swimming in the ocean. When it was deep enough, I sank below my chest, letting the breakers foam me. That's kind of funny. And when I emerged and turned to face Naomi, she was all I could see in the fog. She covered her mouth, nodding, her eyes bright with tears, and then she waved me in, circling her hand as if I were a boy who'd swum out too far. When I returned to her, she kissed my cold cheek and draped a towel over my shoulders, rubbing my back until her hand warmed it with the friction. There, she whispered and clutched me to her before we shambled back to the car. You're clean. I literally have written there, ew, with like a whole bunch of E's. I mean, I just didn't love this. I really shouldn't love the idea of any of this because it's a 36-year-old woman taking advantage of a 14-year-old boy. And that's obviously, first and foremost in my mind. But then this idea that like she would like help him bathe in the ocean. I mean, you should always look at people bathing in the ocean as some kind of rebirth, as some sort of cleansing, as some sort of absolution. But in this case, I mean, yeah, I guess he's really leaning into the creepiness and this idea of like, her whispering, now you're clean. I think it just mixes together with the way that the sex scene was described with all of the metaphors. I just found it not very satisfying. And one of the aspects of the book, too, that I found, I mean, it worked for me in the sense that in the scope of the book, in the world of the book, given the facts of the book, it's appropriate that this woman have some regret. It was a fairly straightforward treatment of like an older woman whose marriage is really shitty and who's having a really hard time and who thinks that she's going to find some sort of inspiration or solace or escape or whatever in this sexual experience with this younger man / boy. But I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't have anything kind of new. So on 461, toward the end of the book, we have this paragraph that really speaks to Naomi's regret. And I think the paragraph itself is written really well. I just felt like a little bit of kind of recycling of this same trope, this miseducation and the corruption of the young boy on the part of the older woman. So on 461, Naomi was seated in the middle of the front hall staircase, in her slip, crying. She looked up and wiped her eyes and waved for me to join her, then took my hand and turned me around so that I was seated with my back to her, between her legs, which formed chair arms as if she were my young king's throne. She pressed her face to my neck and nuzzled me there and cried silently, her body shaking. Her forehead was hot. She calmed down finally and for a long time just sat with her arms weaved around my neck. I don't want to go upstairs, she said. Then, I don't want you ever to leave. Then, I don't want to lose my family. Then, I don't want to be with Sam anymore. Then, I want to wake up in your bed one morning. That really creeped me out. Like, what is she thinking? Which, obviously, one of the gigantic questions of the novel. But actually, wait, like taking that seriously, like it would be refreshing to be inside I'm sure there's a novel out there, but, and I don't know, this is not like a defensible position. I wouldn't want to read someone trying to defend themselves and like think this was a good idea. But I think it would be sort of interesting to have this be just like slightly less kind of cliche. So she says, I want to wake up in your bed one morning. Then I don't want my daughters to ever be this unhappy, which I found actually very moving. Then I don't want to be scared anymore. Then I don't want to keep hating myself. Then I'm so sorry for what I've done to you. So in this rereading here, I have to say, I actually find that kind of moving and kind of fitting and appropriate. I like that she's apologizing, and actually I like that she is articulating all of the reasons why she's essentially articulating all of the reasons that this happened. So in some ways it's very tidy, but I think what kind of got to me was the predictability of it. We're going to close with just a very quick little listing of the things that I really liked and then some of my quibbles. The writing just sort of generally in the book is so good. A lot of the prose is really inventive. Some of it I think is like kind of overwritten. And I think there's a little indulgence here where the reader is really, receiving like a lot of, sort of reiterations of the same idea. And a lot of it's really beautifully worded. But had I been his editor, I think the book might have been like literally like maybe 100 pages shorter. I really like the depiction of the parents, which is weird. Listeners of the Fox page know that I love when people are misbehaving, and I really love it when parents misbehave because I just think it's so fascinating to have kind of like an inside view on what is happening in another family. And these are parents who are, very neglectful, which also rings true with what was happening in the 1980s. I really actually, what I did see of like the showbiz world, I really liked. I thought it was really clever how they kept hearing the father's voice. He did a lot of like advertising and jingles and stuff. And the thing I liked very best about the book was all of the descriptions of New York, although sometimes it got a little name droppy. For me, it was very nostalgic about what New York City was like when I was in college. And this is clearly someone who has a lot of reverence for the city. There's an amazing description of young Griffin being in an elevator in a textile manufacturing firm that I found so compelling because it felt so sort of like behind the scenes. The depiction of New York is just really, really well done. So in terms of quibbles, you can guess. One is that I just thought it was too long. I got a little bogged down in some of the details. I found myself skimming a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons part. I don't know if you're like an avid Dungeons and Dragons person. I'll ask my brother. My little brother, used to be really into that. I don't know how interesting it would be to read about it. Maybe it would be really interesting. I don't know. It's a little like Sally Rooney in Intermezzo. I was actually very happy that we were not given too much chess because I just think like writing about actual chess does not sound like it would be very compelling. Probably even if you are a chess player, I don't know, maybe it would be great to have Sally Rooney writing about it. More specifically, I found that there were digressions that I was like, we just don't need this. One of the reviews that I read, in fact, said that some parts are boring. And then in parentheses, it said, like life. And I was like, yeah, sure, life is boring sometimes, but I'm not sure that we need to imitate the boring parts of life in our 480-page novel. Another review that I read said that sometimes these devolve into these shaggy dog stories. There was one part that I literally skipped the whole chapter. We were going to have, or it does exist in the book. I did not personally have it. There was a whole entire chapter about Griffin's father and his first love. And I just was like, it might inform, interestingly, the affair that Griffin's father is having, and it might tell us more about his parents. But I just was like, I don't want to go back to like, I think it was during the Korean War era. I just was like, I can't remember if it was Vietnam or Korea or something, but I just was like, I do not think that we need to read an entire chapter about this minor character. And lastly, I will say, I don't know if this is actually kind of right between a quibble and something I liked. I thought the ending was fine. I read a different review that was talking about the ending being unsatisfying, and I'm generally like not that upset by an unsatisfying ending. Sometimes I like it when things are tied up in a bow, but this is a book that is so sprawling that I'm not really sure that we were expecting that. So in many ways, I found the ending satisfying. So I'd like to end on a positive note, which is that I really think Adam Ross is such a good writer, and there was a lot to love in this book. And I think in some ways, he, as a male writer who is writing this like very, dare I say, cliche kind of, traditional age gap relationship, we're getting the same kind of Mrs. Robinson trope. It's very nice within the context of these 4 lectures, Intermezzo, Playworld, The Young Man, and The Awakening, to have a book that's a counterpoint in some ways to what it is that these women are doing. So hopefully that's a good little advertisement for you to read some of those other books if you have not already read them. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.